Hey there, it's Erin with Time Saving Templates, and today I'm going to go over some examples of how you can use pivot tables in any of your spreadsheets, whether you are starting from scratch or if you're using a spreadsheet template from Time Saving Templates. You may have a pivot table in one of your templates already, and you might not know it, but I'm going to show you two ways to use the pivot table. The first is if you already have a template that has a pivot table in it. There's a little bit of a shortcut if you want to add more pivot tables so you don't have to start from scratch. And then I'll also show you an example of how to do a pivot table, from start to finish as well. For this example, I have two example templates I'm going to be using. This is the sales and profit tracking, and I've already filled it out with some sample data. You'll see that this is for tracking products that you sell, total sales, payment type. So pivot tables are going to work really well when you have information listed out with column headers across the top right here. We're in row 6 with a lot of data scrolling down the page. I already have some pivot tables here in the sales summary page. You'll see that this summary is actually not a pivot table because if you click in it, you'll see there's a formula. If you click over here though, you'll see there isn't a formula. That's because these next 3 charts are pivot tables. So the way that another way you can tell that something is a pivot table is if you right click inside of it and it has this option for pivot table options or show field list, or actually up here it'll say pivot table analyze. That's a good indication that you're in a pivot table. Plus I always say do data and refresh all anytime you enter information in here, and that is because pivot tables need to be refreshed in order to pull in the information, unlike a set formula, which doesn't need to be refreshed. If you right click and go show field list, you can see the options that I've selected to have in the table, which I've selected product name. We're doing a sum of the total sales, and number sold is the number of items sold. If you have a file that already has a pivot table in it, all you have to do is I would start above it and make sure you're copying all areas and just do a Control-C and then a Control-V. And what you've done is pasted an extra pivot table. That's so that you can still use the existing one. But if you want to add something new, you can now use an extra pivot table, and it's still referencing all the same information, but we can change it now. So if you want to take out customer name and instead you want to look at any of the column headers, you could put into the rows section. So for this example, I'm going to go with payment type. It will automatically total up the total sales and items sold per payment type. You could also add in shipping costs. So I'm just clicking on it and dragging it down. So when I put shipping cost here in the values section, it automatically goes to count of shipping costs, but we want to change that to sum. So you're going to click just a left click on that, and value, instead of count, we want it to be sum. We could also do average, min, max. We can change the name of it, put total shipping cost. And there you go. So that's the quicker way to do it if you already have a pivot table. Now, if you are in an existing pivot table and you want to check what it's referencing, go to pivot table analyze and change data source. And that is going to show you what information the pivot table is pulling from. So this tells me that it's going down to the 100,000th row. If I wanted to change that to be less rows, or maybe if it only went down to 50 rows and you add more rows of data below that, you want to be sure that you're picking up all of the data. So that's also something to check when you are working with an existing pivot table. So you can also change that. And okay, so let me show you how to do the pivot table from start to finish. This is another template I have at Time Saving Templates. This is a Merit increase worksheet are people who work in HR and compensation. So I have all this sample data already entered. I do have some summary charts over here, but I don't have an actual pivot table to use. So what you would do is you would just highlight all the data. I'm just clicking the shift key and scrolling right all the way to the end. I'm gonna scroll here to the bottom of this data set. And once you have everything highlighted that you want, just go to Insert, and then Pivot Table is an option right here. You can also do Pivot Chart. I'm gonna just do Pivot. And we've already selected the range. I always like to do it in a new worksheet, not in the existing worksheet. Okay, so from here we have a blank pivot table, and you'll see that we have the fields here on the right. And what this is every column header in the data that we've selected is listed out up here. And then we get to decide what we want to display is in the rows. We would just drag it into rows, and that's going to show what we want to display down on the rows. And then if we want it to be across, we would pull it into columns, and then it would display across this way. It does help to have an idea of what you want to see in a pivot table, because there are really a lot of options here. But I'm just going to go through a few so you can see the difference that it makes. I'm going to pull in salary band into the rows. That's going to place all the bands that we have filled out in this other worksheet are going to populate there. And then maybe we'll do department across the top. Then for the values, we're going to want to pull in some sort of data that you want summarized. So you could do a count of employee ID if you want to see how many employees are per band. If you're basing it on a count, you need to click value field settings, and you can change this here. We're going to do count. So that'll tell us that there are 2 employees in the commercial department that have a salary band of A, and we can change this to salary, say salary band. So from here, we can also do total increase amount, or we could do merit increase percentage. So it's going to do some, but I think what we want that to show is the average increase amount. The problem with doing something like that is it's showing a 0, but because it's a percentage, we're going to have to go in and change that to a percentage. So it might be easier to have one chart showing employee counts and then do another chart showing all percentage increases. Or maybe we want to move department over here. Then we could list it out this way. Having, the commercial department has 2 people in band A, 10 in band D, 8 in G, and then we would just have to change the one column to be formatted as a percentage, and then we can see the average increase percentages per band within each department. Those are just a few ways you could do the pivot table. There's really a lot you can do with this, so it just kind of depends on what data you're working with and what you would like to see. So to do the budgeted increase versus actual increases, we would need a column for the budgeted amount per increase, and we don't have that. We just have the total budget is calculated up here based on total salary. So you would have to do a few things in order to get that, but we could show the total increase amount there, and then that would show per department. Probably going to want to add a comma there, and then that would show per department their increase amount, and then if you had that budget per department, you could then compare things that way. One other thing to note something to watch out for when you're doing the pivot tables is that if you happen to have a blank column, say this column was blank, and I try to do the pivot table, it's not going to let me because every column header that you have selected needs to have a label to it. So let me just show you what happens, because you might run into this error when you're doing a pivot table. It'll still let me do this part, and then I'll say the pivot table field name is not valid. You must use data that is organized as a list with labeled columns. That error is specifically because this column was blank. And if you happen to have blank columns in between, you might have something that's hidden and it needs a column header. I just put an X in the column, and if it needs to be there and I don't have a label for it, then you can do the pivot table. So just a little tip. I hope this helps, and let me know what you decide to do a pivot table for, because I am curious to see all the different ways that you can use it. And don't forget that I am here to help you streamline and save time when it comes to using your Excel spreadsheet templates. And also check out the free resources. I have some free templates you can try at timesavingtemplates.com/free resources. Thanks so much.